For this video, I'd like to mix things up a little. I thought it would be fun to detour from my more formal, research and editing intensive videos and make something shorter that I can release between larger projects. So today, I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite songs, High to Death, by the indie rock band Car Seat Headrest. And just to be upfront about it, this song touches on some pretty dark subject matter. So if you don't feel you're in the right state of mind for those topics, consider this fair warning. For those who aren't in the know, Car Seat Headrest began as a solo project by my fellow Northern Virginia native Will Toledo at the age of 17, shortly after graduating high school. Having previously released music under both his adopted name and Nervous Young Men, as Car Seat Headrest, Will began to experiment more with song structure, lyrical content, and instrumentation, gaining a small fanbase with his 4 numbered albums and a 5th LP. Then, in November of 2011, he found a degree of Bandcamp stardom with the release of Twin Fantasy, an extremely ambitious lo-fi concept album centered on his then-current relationship. After continuing to dazzle audiences with a string of later releases performed with the aid of several friends and college classmates, the current membership of Car Seat Headrest would be cemented in 2015 when Toledo signed with Matador Records, upon which the band would release Teens of Style, a reworking of several of Toledo's older songs, as well as the follow-up album Teens of Denial a year later, which was made from songs Will had been working on for several years in anticipation of a record deal. But it was not until 2018 that they would release what many in their fanbase consider to be Car Seat Headrest's magnum opus, Twin Fantasy Face to Face, a part remaster, part reimagining of the album that rocketed Will Toledo to fame in the first place. With influences as diverse as Pink Floyd, The Beach Boys, Daniel Johnston, and They Might Be Giants, and tracks ranging from the calm and wistful to the energetic and lively to the brooding and soul-crushing, as well as some that blend all three. In my opinion, Twin Fantasy Face to Face is the definitive example of a postmodern album, heavily aware of that which has come before, yet determined to add something new, cloaked in defensive irony at times, only to be raw and soul-bearing at others, willing to return to familiar paths with the knowledge gleaned from having traveled far beyond them, while also never afraid to delve into bold experimentation, and full of both subtle and overt references to not only Will's earlier discography and life, but the myriad songs, albums, and artists that inspired him. And while Twin Fantasy was in many ways shaped by Toledo's experiences growing up gay in the 2000s and early 2010s, in a society that was far less tolerant and accepting with regards to sexuality, the vague and poetic way in which Will references this allows for fairly universal applicability as he conveys feelings of heartbreak, loneliness, and alienation. The point I'm getting at here is, if you like indie rock, or even if you don't but my description sounds intriguing, I cannot recommend this album highly enough. Twin Fantasy contains 10 tracks, across which Will reflects on a prior relationship during his formative years that ended poorly. And while I could probably go on for hours about the entire album, today I'd like to focus solely on the 8th track. High to Death opens with a melancholic, contemplative, reverb-drenched chord progression that perfectly sets the tone for the rest of the song. And after properly establishing the atmosphere, the singer begins with the lines,
I fell over, I fell onto the ground. Ooh, I wish I was sober. I can't get up off the ground.
All in all, it's a rather straightforward depiction of being heavily intoxicated, highlighting one of the most recognizable aspects of Car Seat Headrest's style, that of employing stream-of-consciousness writing in their lyrics. Often, Toledo's songs will meander through seemingly mundane subject matter rather than sticking to a single, more developed or grandiose thought or through-line, such as with the intro of Beach Life and Death, where he recalls a trip to Harper's Ferry, and then recounts the aimless, repetitive boredom of life as an anomic young adult. But as the backing instruments shift into a more rhythmic section, and the first proper stanza comes in, Toledo's lyrics take on far more depth and nuance.
When I close my eyes and I thought I was blind, it's the middle of the night and I'll never be alright again. And this wallpaper keeps going round the room. It keeps going round the room. It keeps going round the room. And I follow it around the room. And I follow it around the
On the surface, these lyrics might seem to only continue the narrative established in the opening lines, of someone sitting alone in a darkened room, drunk, struggling to maintain consciousness as the walls appear to spin around them. But what I love about these lines is that the vague nature of their writing, along with the haunting way in which they are sung and the beautiful accompanying instrumentation, leaves so much room open for interpretation. The first lines of the stanza, "When I closed my eyes and I thought I was blind," imply that the subject of the song is limiting himself, only to blame his problems on the world around him, believing himself to be metaphorically unable to see, when in reality it is he who has shut his own eyes. But the next lines add more context. It's the middle of the night, and I'll never be all right again. To continue with the metaphor of sight, perhaps, despite limiting himself through shutting his eyes, it doesn't matter, as the singer wouldn't be able to see anyway. If it's the middle of the night, then would there even be anything to see? Perhaps what the singer means by this is that he is in the midst of one of his darker moods, the middle of a figurative night, at which point everything can seem misleadingly dark. And while the line, "and I'll never be all right again," might be taken more literally to describe his intoxicated state, I think it also speaks to his mental state as he sits alone and depressed in a darkened room, longing for human contact. We can't even know for certain what he means by this statement. Is it an acknowledgement that the world around him will never get better, or an admission of his own personal failings, a reluctant acceptance that the singer himself will not be able to overcome his flaws? And is it even accurate, or merely a reflection of his depressed, intoxicated mental state causing him to sink into unjustified pessimism? Toledo then sings of staring at the wallpaper as the world appears to spin around him, abandoning these higher thoughts to allow himself to become lost in the rhythm of the world, a rhythm that ultimately exists only in his head. From here, we are treated to a brief transitional bridge, utilizing the same undulating riff from the first stanza, but with Toledo employing his voice like an instrument, as he commonly does, adding an even more reflective and sorrowful tinge. And after that, we come to what might be my favorite section of the song, the reprise from Stop Smoking, the third track of Twin Fantasy. But before we discuss its use here, I believe some background information is in order. Another defining feature of Will Toledo's music is his use of reincorporation, by which he frequently reuses and remixes elements of his older music in later works. One of the reasons that delving into his extensive discography can be so rewarding. From listening to the earlier iterations of Painstar and Famous Prophets that eventually made their way into the final version of the penultimate track on this album, to hearing alternate versions of songs like Romantic Theory or Ryan North by Northwest, to even discovering that the second chorus of Times to Die was inspired by the coda of the first track on one of Will's earliest teenage albums. The music of Car Seat Headrest is constantly referencing itself. But it doesn't merely repeat or copy. These reincorporations are done for very specific reasons, and one of the most impactful, at least in my view, comes in High to Death. Twin Fantasy's third track, Stop Smoking, is the simplest on the album, both in terms of instrumentals and lyrics. Played entirely on an acoustic guitar, it contains the lines, "Stop smoking, we love you, and we don't want you to die." A very straightforward message, even when extrapolated beyond actual smoking. It is a plea for someone to end their destructive habits, appealing to the fact that others care about them. But often, the simplest lyrics can be imbued with a deceptively large amount of meaning and impact. One of the greatest examples of this that comes to mind is the track Vera from Pink Floyd's The Wall, the shortest on the entire double album. In it, Roger Waters references the singer Vera Lynn, whose interwar song We'll Meet Again became extremely popular during the Second World War, offering hope to both soldiers and their families back home that they would be reunited one day. But Waters' own father was killed in action before he ever had a chance to meet the man, and the subsequent lack of a father figure in his life contributed greatly, at least in Waters' own estimation, to many of his later struggles and insecurities. With only a handful of lines, Waters manages to convey the sorrow of losing a parent he never even got to meet, and the struggles of growing up without a father in a world that seemed to forget the man's sacrifice and the family he left behind. This is one of the greatest strengths of music, to convey ideas and elicit emotions with a minimum of context, and Will Toledo manages much the same in High to Death. After concluding the first stanza and the transitional bridge, we are treated to a reprise of Stop Smoking, only the lyrics have been changed. As Twin Fantasy is a concept album, its tracks comprise a story, and the tone of High to Death stands in stark contrast to the more carefree, upbeat, frenetic nature of the earlier songs. Rather than pleading for someone to stop smoking, and telling them that they are loved by a vague we, Toledo gives up on trying to make his significant other drop their bad habits and directly tells them, "I love you." And instead of appealing to the other's safety with the line, "and we don't want you to die," he instead sings a much more frightened and vulnerable, "but I don't want to die." Is this an acceptance of a loved one's destructive tendencies, telling them that the singer will continue to love them for who they are rather than demand that they grow? Or is it an admission of the singer's own failure to help them? Or perhaps the singer is abandoning care in the face of their depressed state, fearful only about their own life, unconcerned now with the fate of even those closest to them. Is it a plea for help as they contemplate their own mortality, or an agreement to accept one another despite their flaws? The song's title, High to Death, serves as a reflection to that of the album's fourth track, Sober to Death, signaling a shift in the singer's attitude that mirrors the altered reprise of Stop Smoking, where before the singer had desired to break free of the constraints of their life, believing themselves to be in danger, metaphorically speaking, of being sober to death, or boring and mundane, they have now come to realize that their destructive, hedonistic tendencies have put them on a dangerous path, not only in terms of physical intoxication, but in how they treat and connect with others. And interestingly enough, these two tracks both contain reprises of the coda of Overexposed Enjoy, a song from Monomania, the album released as a follow-up to the original Twin Fantasy. And this provides a good example of just how complex the connections within Will's discography can truly get. Sober to Death's coda utilizes the line, "Don't worry, you and me won't be alone no more," while High to Death's final musical section reprises the lyrics overlaid with this, which we will come to shortly. After the reprise of Stop Smoking, the song enters a second instrumental bridge, and as the music gradually builds in a dark, ominous chord progression, a brief audio sample of a child yelling for someone named William to let them out can be heard amongst the music. This audio sample comes from a screen adaptation of Ray Bradbury's science fiction short story, All Summer in a Day, which is set on Venus after the planet has been extensively terraformed for human settlement. In the narrative, the planet's unique atmosphere results in constant rainfall, with the only chance of its inhabitants seeing sunlight coming for 1 hour every 7 years. The story focuses on a class of 9-year-old students, none of whom are old enough to remember experiencing sunlight, except for one girl, Margot, whose family moved to Venus from Earth 5 years prior. As the hour of sunlight approaches, it is Margot who most looks forward to it. But when the girl tries to describe her experiences and memories of the sun, the other students, led by a boy named William, doubt and mock her. This culminates in Margot's bullies locking her in a closet, ignoring her pleas to be let out. When the rain ceases a short time later, the other students are let outside to play in the sunlight, forgetting about Margot until the clouds return and they are ushered back inside, at which point they are overcome with guilt. The story ends with them gathering around the closet, which now sits silent in the darkness before them. One of the central themes of twin fantasy is the concept of fantasy itself, and of immersing oneself within one, even to the point of becoming trapped, rather than facing reality. By sheer coincidence, the bully character of All Summer in a Day happened to share a first name with Will Toledo, and I interpret the latter's use of this audio sample as an attempt to convey a conflict within his own heart. The William in the story appears to represent a part of Toledo that attempts to figuratively trap or lock up his more idealistic side, while Margot in turn represents that very idealism and optimism, the part of Will that is still capable of seeing beauty in the world, and sharing the resulting joy and appreciation with others. In the album booklet for Twin Fantasy, High to Death is given the subtitle All Summer in a Night, implying that, much like how in Bradbury's short story, the singer is being denied a brief chance to see the world without a figurative layer of storm clouds blotting out the light. Just as how Margot is prevented from enjoying her hour in the sun by the callous pessimism of those around her, the singer in High to Death approaches a state of clarity in the midst of his intoxication and depression, only to have it stolen from him by his internal shadow. While most people associate the concept of immersing oneself in fantasy with escapism and superficial happiness, depending on one's state of mind, a person could very well trap themselves in a dark fantasy by mistake, preventing themselves from experiencing joy in the real world. And even immersing oneself within a pleasant fantasy can have dire repercussions if it leaves a person unable to face the challenges of the real world. Here, as with the rest of the album, Toledo appears to be saying that while our fantasies can be useful for coping with grief and trauma, and distracting us from the demands of the world, we should not let them subsume our minds, and we should take care to avoid letting our most pessimistic thoughts overwhelm the parts of us capable of feeling optimism. As the sample concludes, the music continues to build before returning to the soft, somber progression of the verse, at which point Will sings,
And I sat there on the steps, considering death. There were only seconds left of the night, and I said, hell is the sun, burning forever at the center of things, a ball on fire at the center of things, a ball on fire at the center of things, a brain on fire at the center of things, a brain on fire at the center of things.
and I honestly think this stanza contains some of the most powerful lyrics I've ever encountered. In the first two lines, Toledo conjures an image of someone sitting alone in the darkness, the final two words chilling in how vague they are. Given the context provided by the earlier lyrics, the singer could mean that he is considering death in a distant or abstract sense, contemplating his own mortality, or he could be considering ending his own life in the face of his depression. But the next line adds further uncertainty, and opens up even more avenues of interpretation. There were only seconds left of the night. This evokes a sense of foreboding, of grim anticipation, of the time remaining to the singer dwindling. But that raises the question, until what? Given the prior line, this counting down cannot help but seem ominous, as if the singer sees his own life tied to the fading night, now almost gone. But this phrasing and the melancholic instrumentation distract, perhaps deliberately, from what is coming next. If there are only seconds left of the night, then that means that the sun is about to rise, recontextualizing this line to be far more optimistic. After all, the phrase, "it's always darkest before the dawn," has long since passed into cliché, And so perhaps this mental darkness that the singer is experiencing is much like the pre-dawn darkness, a final, deceptively powerful misery that strikes them just before they overcome their depression and emerge into the metaphorical light of day. However, the remainder of the stanza turns this on its head as the singer remarks, "And I said hell is the sun, burning forever at the center of things." Sitting alone in the darkness of early morning, the singer seems to be aware of the coming sunrise, and yet this does not appear to provide them any solace. In fact, if anything, it seems to do the opposite, with the singer conjuring the vivid imagery of the world in orbit around an endless fire, of hell, a place of eternal punishment and suffering, as the focal point of all existence. And as he reflects on this imagery, the singer shifts from describing the sun as an inanimate object, a ball on fire at the center of things, and begins likening it to a human mind, a brain on fire at the center of things. In this way, the singer seems to acknowledge conscious awareness as the most important aspect of existence, placing it metaphysically in the same position that the sun enjoys in our solar system, even as he laments life's inherent suffering, poetically describing conscious existence as a state of being consumed by flames. But this last line, dark as it may seem on the surface, helps to ground us in the singer's subjective frame of reference, and in doing so it may contain a peculiar optimism. Once again, this dour viewpoint may very well only be a passing thought, reflective not of reality but of the singer's present mental state, in which he cannot help but see everything as bleak or pointless, a state that will soon pass with sobriety and the coming of sunrise. In this, I think the inclusion of the preface, "and I said," before the singer's observations should not be ignored. Following this stanza, we are treated to the song's coda, in which Toledo reprises a section of one of his earlier songs, Overexposed in Joy, from the album Monomania, itself released as a follow-up to the original Twin Fantasy. Solemn and reflective, Will sings,
I can't turn this thing off, it keeps following me. Used to be so human, now it's just a machine. I can't turn this thing off, it keeps following me. When you say you were leaving, when you really leave. I can't turn this thing off, it keeps following me. Used to be so human, now it's just a machine. I can't turn this thing off.
Though the singer remains unspecific in addressing what exactly it is that is following him, I believe the implication is that he is being followed by the memory of his prior relationship, and the happiness and support he drew from it. While the singer has clearly tried to get over this loss, he remains unable to, likening it to an aspect of himself that has now become dead weight, little more than a shadow trailing his footsteps, one that keeps following him in spite of his efforts to turn it off. And the next lines imply that as time has passed, and the passion of the relationship has faded, leaving only cold, distant remnants, the singer's memories have lost their warmth as well, reduced to lifeless, mechanical imitations of the comfort and companionship he once enjoyed, and still desires. And this interpretation draws support from the final two lines, in which the singer asks, "When'd you say you were leaving? When'd you really leave?" Which I believe represents the discrepancy between the end of his relationship and his inability to move on, because with how much his mind dwells on their past together, in a way the singer's significant other has not fully left him. As the final line concludes, we are left hearing only a chopped, distorted remnant of its echo, as if the song is playing from a machine breaking down after overuse and mishandling, much like the singer's memories of his prior relationship may have changed and degraded over time, leaving just a machine in their place. But the song isn't over yet. As chopped variations of these final lines and notes softly play in the background, listeners are treated to a voicemail recording by the artist Hojin Stella Jung about the submission of her portfolio to the Nevada Museum of Arts. In this sample, Jung recounts her experience creating a collection of paintings titled The Lady, her voice wistful and vulnerable as she recalls her emotional state during the creative process. But as the young artist continues, describing her portfolio almost as if it were a living person, she states,
It was intense. It was an intense process, and it was how I was trying to very hard personify that intensity. But it's hard to talk about her now because I think she's left with me. At least that's how I feel, and I'm trying to figure out what to do now. And I love her. At least I did, but now I feel lost, and I'm unsure of what to think and feel most of the time. But I did believe in her, the lady, and maybe there is a different form now that the intensity takes.
As she concludes, Jung receives only an automated response in reply. Now, at first glance, this may seem like quite a strange way to end this song. And indeed, those familiar with the 2011 release of Twin Fantasy often state that they prefer the original outro, in which Will sings an altered version of the coda from Pink Floyd's Jug Band Blues, the last song that deeply troubled lead singer Syd Barrett released as a member of the band. But while copyright considerations likely played a role in this change, I think Will had a very good reason for choosing to conclude High to Death with this specific piece of audio, which leads us to another defining feature of his discography, a heightened awareness of its existence as music, and of its place within the artistic medium. Car Seat Headrest's music tends to be very metatextual, by which I mean that Toledo frequently brings awareness to the fact that the audience is listening to music and comments on his own work, both in relation to his career and in regards to his and his music's existence within the broader art form. This meta aspect ranges from the simple and humorous to the introspective and profound. One of the most popularly cited instances occurs in the song Bodies, when at a point in which standard songs would enter a chorus, he asks, "Is it the chorus yet?" "No, it's just the building of the verse. So when the chorus does come, it'll be more rewarding," before beginning an alternate verse, highlighting the song's unique structure. In the final track of How to Leave Town, Toledo's last album produced before signing with a record label, he sings, "It's time to show them what you can do. What can you do, eh? What can you do?" In the Gun song, reflecting on a tendency to explore personal problems through his music rather than confront them head-on, Will asks himself,
If you felt some kind of stirring against interpretation, why write these songs at all? Why not become didactic? Tell everyone on the planet in plain English what you are.
And in Drunk Drivers, Killer Whales, Toledo laments how the negative experiences of life have ground him down, leaving him bitter and disillusioned, stripping many of the positive aspects of his youth, leading to the singer comparing himself to a drunk driver in his own body, a danger to himself and those around him. But in spite of this, he optimistically reflects that if one can grow acclimated to changing for the worse, then perhaps it is also possible to turn one's life around for the better. In choosing to sample this artist's monologue, I think Will is reflecting on Twin Fantasy itself as a work of art. The album he wrote in his formative years when attempting to balance a meaningful relationship with the strains of adolescence. The album that catapulted him to stardom and set him on his present path. And the album that, in some ways, perhaps he feels he's outgrown. At 26, signed to a record label, with a bright future ahead of him and a sizable fan base behind him, having had years to form new relationships and mend old ones, to grow and develop, Will Toledo must have been a very different person from the vulnerable, anxious, and confused 19-year-old recording alone on a laptop in his car. Much of the pain that fueled the initial writing of Twin Fantasy back in 2011, the experiences that gave the album its heart and soul, that allowed it to connect with so many people, must have faded by the time of its remastering 7 years later, captured in a snapshot in his music, carried on without direct context for audiences around the world. And while I'm ready to admit that I might have it wrong, I can't help but see this interpretation supported in Jung's closing lines on that voicemail, reflecting on a beloved work of art long after the initial passion and pain that fueled its creation has faded. All you have to do is substitute the name of Will's album for her portfolio. It was an intense process, and it was how I was trying very hard to personify that intensity. But it's hard to talk about Twin Fantasy now, and I'm trying to figure out what to do now. And I loved the album, at least I did, but now I feel lost, and unsure of what to think and feel most of the time. But I did believe in it, twin fantasy, and maybe there is a different form now that the intensity takes. In many ways, twin fantasy face-to-face seems to be Will's attempt to close the book on a pivotal chapter of his life, a chapter he is contented to let rest after this final send-off, before he embarks on the next. As he states at the end of the album's final track, reflecting on having moved on from the relationship that birthed the album, while still being able to cherish his memories of it, "This is the end of the song, and it is just a song. This is a version of me and you that can exist outside of everything else. And if it is just a fantasy, then anything can happen from here. The contract is up, the names have been changed. So pour one out, whoever you are. These are only lyrics now." Before I close out this video, I'd like to thank ethanJP for allowing me to use his adorable artwork in the thumbnail. And while I've got your attention, I might as well recommend some Car Seat Headrest songs, in case this video has gotten anyone out there interested in the band. The two most approachable albums in my view are Teens of Style, a studio remastering of many of Will Toledo's early songs that retains his signature lo-fi indie aesthetic, and, of course, Twin Fantasy Face to Face. Choose the former if you want a fun and energetic collection of singles, and the latter if you want to be taken on an emotional roller coaster with a strong thematic through-line. If I had to choose a gateway song for their music, it'd either be Bodies or Times to Die. I dare anyone who's remotely interested in rock to listen to Bodies and not want to hear more from the band. For those looking for longer songs, Will has quite a collection. One of my favorites, Hey Space Cadet, is a Pink Floyd-inspired reflection on his journey as an artist about to make the transition from indie darling to label-signed star. The second track on Twin Fantasy, Beach Life in Death, is a thrilling, curveball-throwing, soul-bearing adventure through the ups and downs of adolescence. Several times now, I've heard it be called the Bohemian Rhapsody of this generation, and I've also heard it said that Bohemian Rhapsody walked so this song could fly. And from Nervous Young Man, both Boxing Day and The Gun Song highlight Toledo's talent at long-form songwriting and composition. The former is a bombastic, chaotic lo-fi expression of vulnerability and existential anxiety, while the latter is a sometimes tragic, sometimes sardonic epitaph for a failed relationship, rounded off with a phenomenal guitar solo and a cathartic, grungy cover of Neil Young's Down by the River. By the way, make sure you listen to the original version of The Gun Song to catch that last part, not the copyright-altered no-trigger version. If you prefer shorter, less experimental or grandiose, and more tonally upbeat songs, Please Mr. Pilot, Romantic Theory, and Fill in the Blank all fit the bill, as well as nearly all of Teens of Style. And if you want something in between, there's Drunk Driver's Killer Whales, a melancholic yet ultimately optimistic reflection on adulthood and personal growth, and Rebel Radio, a sort of alternative, expanded version of Romantic Theory that substitutes the explosive, compact nature of the latter with a more wistful, bittersweet quality. There's a little something for everybody. Or, at least, I'd like to think there is. Now, to return to the album, and specifically song, at hand. As can be said for many works of art, both the songwriters and the people their songs were written about live on, continuing to change and grow, to better themselves, to shed old fears and insecurities, to learn to move on from the past. While their songs remain with us, frozen in stasis, living in a kind of perpetual youth, inhabiting a twilight zone between reality and fiction. And should we ever feel like returning to those memories, or finding new personal meaning in the lyrics others have composed about their own prior experiences, the songs will be there, waiting for us. And I think there is a comfort to be found in that. After all, they're only lyrics now.